Happy Thursday, everybody. I am the host of Bold Leaders in Learning, Brandon Busteed, Chief Partnership Officer and Global Head of Learn Work Innovation at Kaplan. And I'm looking forward to the conversation today with Leo Lambert, somebody who was at the helm of Elon University as the president there for roughly 20 years, somebody who I got in touch with through my mentor, actually, the original introduction, Leo, which you may not remember, was through Joel Fleischman, one of my professors and longstanding mentors at Duke University. And so it's only apropos that that was how you and I connected, and that we're talking about your book today entitled Relationship-Rich Education, a title that I love, by the way. So everybody, get ready for a great conversation today. Leo, thanks for joining us. I would love to just have you say a little bit more about your own background and a little bit about Elon too, because its history and investment in a culture of relationship-rich education is a big part of this, and I think a big driver of how you thought to dive into this book. So thanks for being on the show with me.
It's my pleasure, Brandon. Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here. So I began my career in the mid-1970s at the University of Vermont with a newly minted master's degree, working in their Living Learning Center, living with a community of 600 students and about a dozen faculty and staff families. This is when the residential college movement was getting started, and lots of experiments were taking place in residential education. That was a great 2 years. I had the opportunity to serve as acting director of that program my last year at UVM. And the director of the Living Learning Center at the time was a dean level position. And here I was, this young guy in his early 20s, sitting with the provost and the academic council and getting kind of an inside look at higher education. It was a fascinating and wonderful time in my life. I went on to do my PhD at Syracuse and never left. I stayed at Syracuse for 14 years. When I finished up there, I was dean of the graduate school, and I had a lot of interesting work to do at Syracuse. I think most notably, creating the Future Professoriate Project. We had this idea that we shouldn't just be taking 800 graduate students and turning them loose on undergrads with no preparation in teaching. And so we took that agenda very seriously, and Syracuse's program became a national model. And then I went on to become the provost, a provost in the University of Wisconsin system. And then this place called Elon gave me a ring. I had been named in Change magazine to a list of 40 young leaders under 40. And you can imagine headhunters started calling. Condoleezza Rice was also on that list that year.
Pretty good list, yeah.
It was a good list. And I was not interested in the presidency, but Elon kept persisting, and the values and mission of this place were just so clearly in line with my own. I decided to put my hat in the ring. It was the only presidency I ever applied for, and had a wonderful 20 years as president here. So Elon is a very special place, deeply committed to engaged and experiential learning. I led 2 10-year strategic plans here. Elon, I think, focused very deeply during those 20 years on academic excellence. We sheltered a chapter of Phi Beta Kappa by focusing very hard on the centrality of the arts and sciences. We built great professional schools. But we also doubled down on Elon's brand for active and engaged experiential education. U.S. News and World Report does this survey every year asking, where are the lighthouse programs in high impact practices like study abroad and service learning and freshman capstone experiences and internships. There's 8 of them. Elon is the only school in the nation listed as an exemplar in all 8 of those categories, which I think reflects the intentionality to be excellent in teaching active and engaged learning and experiential education. That's what we focused on very hard for 20 years, and I think really moved the institution forward.
Yeah. Well, and one of the, I know, the book is a wonderful example of stories and best practices from all across higher ed, 2-year, 4-year, public, private. I think you guys did a great job curating the interviews and getting a broad swath examples by institutions, but around these same fundamental, aspects of what you call relationship-rich education. And your point about intentionality, it just keeps coming through every point in the book, right? These things don't happen. If they happen accidentally, it's happening for a small percentage of students, right? It's, but the institutions that have really driven towards a place of success have been very intentional in this. And even in the description of what you talked about in the book about Elon, it didn't happen overnight. I mean, that was one of the other points, is that the investments that Elon made in this happen over time. And I think one of the big ones that I wanted you to just talk a little bit about is you start to build a culture that then attracts faculty who want to be part of that kind of teaching and investment, that then, there's this, reinforcing kind of cycle. On day one, it wasn't like every faculty member bought into relationship-rich education, but now over a cycle, that's part of the culture. So I would just love to have you talk about that a little bit as well.
Sure. Well, you put your, as I would suspect, your finger right on the key word right in your first question, Brandon, which is culture. I think I've often said that if I learned anything about leadership as 20 years as a college president, it's that leadership is about the stewardship of culture. Plainly and simply, that's what it's about. And I think if, as we say in the book, if an institution is really committed to students and to being a relationship-rich environment full of mentoring conversations for students, first of all, you have to value students, and you have to value the students you have, not the students you used to have or the students that some of your colleagues wished you had. The ones that are right before you right now, those are the ones you need to pay attention to. And this day and age, that student body is no longer this image in the American consciousness of the white male on a leafy residential campus who's having the best 4 years of his life, right? That's not who the American college student is anymore. And we need to recognize that. She is most likely to be female, increasingly a student of color, first generation students, at community colleges, often working and going to school at the same time, oftentimes trying to emerge from poverty. So when I talk about understanding who your students are, that's fundamental. But culture is, I think, also valuing the idea that everybody has to buy into creating this relationship-rich campus, including and especially the staff. I mean, staff who work in dining halls and who clean residence halls are students' mentors and confidants and friends and encouragers. They're a really important part of this equation. I think it also involves valuing very high quality teaching, recognizing, as Peter and I think, discovered anew writing this book, that the classroom is the most important place on campus. And we need to put all of our attention and energy and resources in making the classroom experience as rich and full and lively and active as it possibly can be. I think one of the issues is that institutions of higher education for a very long time have valued metrics of prestige over metrics of student engagement.
Yep.
And that has led us astray. I think the metrics of student engagement are key. We were one of the first schools to join the National Survey of Student Engagement, have used it every year. And we pay attention to those details about how many times a year do you get invited over to a professor's house for dinner, and how many papers over 20 pages are you writing? Because we know those are the papers that you're going through multiple drafts with your professor on. And those are the metrics to pay attention to. Less, and I think we should pay less attention. These are important, but it's not about alumni giving rates and the number of books in the library. it's about, what are your students doing?
Yeah, look, and I mean, you're preaching to the choir, on points that I've made in different ways, and through the lens of the work I was involved with, leading the Gallup Purdue Index research, and all that was learned from that. I mean, one of the, it's always surprising to me, right, that NESE, high impact practices, student engagement, these have long been topics in higher education. I would argue we've long had a good idea of what moves the needle, yet for some reason we still caught up on other metrics that distract us from that core purpose of student engagement. We still have incentive systems that, for example, for a lot of universities, especially research universities, faculty get ahead in a system that we refer to as a publish or perish system.
Exactly.
And I always joke, what if we had one that was about mentoring or meandering? And, I know Elon is closer to a system of mentor or meander as opposed to publish or perish. They're not always mutually exclusive, of course, but, we also haven't, so we haven't been as intentional as we could. We haven't been charting the right metrics. And then where we haven't taken it to scale, except in rare instances, right? So take me to, some of the key points in the book. And I think for those who haven't read it, it's well worth reading. But you talk about the 4 relationship principles that are just, consistent. Tell us about that a little bit. And then from there, I want to talk about scale and how we get to a place where this isn't just accidentally happening in some classrooms, but it's part of the experience, right?
Sure. Well, your questions, Brandon, are right on the money. This past weekend, I was working on an essay for Ibu Patel, who's the president of the Interfaith Youth Corps, and he's asked about 30 higher education leaders across the country to reimagine higher education in a very short essay, 1,000 words, to reimagine higher education. So, my probably not surprisingly to you, my point was that if we're really going to be intentional, what we have to do, intentional about relationships, that is, what we have to do is think about the most central and highly valued work of institutions needs to be helping every student form a constellation of mentors that is invested in helping that student become the very best that they can be, their fullest, truest self, intellectually, emotionally, spiritually, physically, as full human beings. That's the intention. So the 4 principles are very simple. We've known for almost 50 years that relationships matter in college, right? I mean, this is not news. Alexander Aston, in his landmark book in 1976, 4 Critical Years, told us that the student-faculty involvement variable was the best variable in terms of predicting student satisfaction. Vincent Tinto's theory of student retention 30 years ago was all about this same thing. And more recent scholars like Estella Ben-Simone have written about the very same principle, especially related to students of color today. So we went out and we interviewed 400 people for our book, 396 actually. And we transcribed every interview. We had mountains of data and lots of great stories. And we sifted through all of those stories and came up with these 4 big ideas that really form kind of the backbone of our book. The first is that every student must experience welcome and deep care. What our colleague across the street, David Scobie at Bringing Theory to Practice, oftentimes calls relentless welcome. Whether you are a student in the Ivy League at Brown, or you're at LaGuardia Community College in Queens, or you are at a fully online university like Southern New Hampshire University, we heard over and over and over again that the question that I think students desire most today is, how are you? And then have somebody just listen generously to their response. It's simple, but deep care. Welcome is not a few formal words at convocation or orientation, right? It's constant at the beginning of every class. And in the middle of every semester, students are feeling embraced. So that's principle one. The second is that every student has to be inspired to learn. And here again, we make the point that the classroom is the most important place on our campuses. Faculty who are passionate about their discipline, passionate about students, are using active and engaged pedagogy, are setting students' minds on fire. We have a little ceremony every year at Elon called 10 Under 10, where we recognize 10 young alums who graduated less than 10 years ago. This year it had to be virtual because of the pandemic.
Right.
So these students' responses were video recorded and played on live stream. And they were so moving. But essentially every single one of them was about that student's constellation of mentors. And it usually began with a classroom experience that then branched out into lots of conversations with faculty outside of class who became their mentors and colleagues and friends. And these are relationships that are going to go on for 20 or 30 years. You just know.
Yeah. The
third principle is that every student must develop a web of significant relationship. And I think this gets to your point about scale. We can't scale this if we're going to try to find a single major professor who is going to mentor you along every dimension of your life, intellectually, spiritually, emotionally. We need many mentors. Some of them can be peers. Many of them can be staff. Hopefully several will be faculty members. But it also ties back to your earlier point about culture, that Brad Johnson at the U.S. Naval Academy calls this, this is who we are and what we do and how we show up to work every day, this culture of mentoring conversations. That's what we do at the Naval Academy, mentoring conversations in the line at the dining hall, everywhere. And so the important thing about developing a web of relationships is actually explaining to students fairly early on that this is one of the most important outcomes of college.
Right.
But we don't do that.
Yeah.
We need to be much more intentional about not only explaining that to students, but helping them develop the strategies to build these relationships over 4 years, 2 or 4 years. And then finally, the fourth principle is that every student must get to these big questions of meaning and purpose. Who am I? What are my gifts to the world? How can I make the world a more just place? And that's what a university education is all about ultimately, right? Is getting to the big questions. And those big questions are best explored in relationships with people that really care about you and love you. And that's why these constellations of mentors are so important. So those 4 ideas are the backbone of relationship-rich education.
Yeah, and look, every one of them is important, and you're right. They're not new. It isn't new news. But I always, feel like it's a really important reminder, refresher, kind of recharge around the core mission of higher education. And I'm so glad that you guys added that fourth one about engaged in questions of their purpose and whatnot, because I go back to, well, a couple things. One personal, example, which is that to this day, the most memorable and toughest assignment I ever had in college was Professor Alma Blunt, who asked us in the very first class to write a paper about our purpose in life. And I mean, we were all like, what? Like, what do you mean? Like, and wrestling with a relatively short paper on your purpose in life was an unbelievable challenge. And then the conversations that flowed from that assignment, I mean, you can only imagine. But so I can personally relate to a very specific example of that. And then I go to the Gallup Purdue Index research, and the single most important aspect of college as it relates to long-term, likelihood of being engaged in your work or thriving in your well-being was whether you said you had a mentor who encouraged your goals and dreams. Now, it was the specific phrasing that's really important in that question. First of all, strongly worded statement. There's no, I kind of sort of did, it's that you either had one or you didn't. There's no maybe in that, but it's the who encouraged my goals and dreams part that's so profound to me. Because first you have to ask somebody what they want to be or what they're thinking about, right? And then you have to do something that moves them in a way, either mentally or in other ways towards that. So I just think that's such an important point, that fourth one, that we brush over maybe a little bit too much. And I'm curious if you agree with that.
Oh, completely. It is, Brandon, it's horrific to me when you listen to how we talk to students about college, how oftentimes the language devolves into this very transactional language. What I call, you've got to do this by then to get there. It's bargaining over grades or degree requirements, getting over hoops. How do I get into this fraternity or that sorority? And we need to be very intentional about capturing and using much more relational language to talk to students about the purpose of being here. And that all ends up with these, leads to these big questions. I think, for example, about how many academic advising appointments between students and faculty where people open up their notebooks, they go right to the degree audit, they start looking at, okay, what are you going to take next semester? Let me see, you haven't taken calculus yet, you better do that. You need one more foreign language class, as opposed to, are you happy? What are you thinking about doing? How's your life going? How are you? That takes time. And which gets back to your earlier point about rewards. Faculty and staff who do this work, I think, do it best in institutional cultures where it's recognized and rewarded and valued. But unfortunately, I don't know of very many places, I'd be interested if you do, in the country that explicitly put this kind of work as a bucket to measure when you're talking about promotion and tenure and career advancement. Until that changes, probably this agenda is not going to get as far as we would like. The encouraging thing is that there are so many faculty and staff and institutional leaders that understand this stuff and are working at a very grassroots level, doing amazing things, sometimes on their own with no money, making gigantic differences in students' lives. So building the relationship-rich campus, we know how to do it. I mean, there's a million examples and millions of people who are doing this work well, but it's not mission critical yet at a lot of institutions. In fact, I would say probably the majority of institutions.
Right. Yeah, and I would agree with you, right? I mean, there's the expression, you are what you measure. And if we're not always measuring these things, if we don't put these things as part of the rewards, incentive, promotion, whatever, categories, it's, and, you make the point in the book. I mean, in some cases, our incentives are counter to this, right? Where faculty who are doing mentoring for students are doing it at their own peril relative to the other priorities that they have on their plate. And, one of the other things I wanted to make sure I mentioned, one of the points you made in the book about great classroom experiences was that faculty need to start by making an effort to know every student's name. And, that's another one where, go back to the Gallup research for the graduates who said they had professors who cared about them as a person. When you did, in-depth interviews with those graduates, asking them, what made you feel that they cared about you? The number one answer, right, was it started with, well, they knew my name. Yeah. And, they would go on and say other things like, and then they did this and they pulled me aside and made me work hard on something I didn't get. And so it always expanded, but it started with that just really simple, basic step of they knew my name. But then you realize, like, how far we have to go just on a metric like that, right? So
my co-author, Peter Felton, who's a professor of history here at Elon and assistant provost for teaching and learning, and just a brilliant, brilliant guy. I think the other sense of urgency, I think that we were feeling as we were writing this book, gets back to this notion about how much the American college student demographic has changed. And all of these things that we're talking about are important for all students. They're doubly important for what we call in our book the new majority students, students of color, first generation students, LGBT students who are oftentimes feeling like they are on the margins of the university experience. So I think there's a sense that if there's ever a time in American higher education where intentionality about relationships is important, it's now, because the nature of our student body is changing before our eyes, and needs this work to happen to ensure their success. You know, we point to at CUNY the ASAP program, which is designed to get students through an associate's degree program by great mentoring, great relationships, and removing all of the micro hurdles that get in the way of young people finishing college. I don't have childcare. I don't have a Metro Pass. I don't have a way to get to school. That's all built into the program. Or at Elon, our Odyssey program for first generation college students comes with significant funding. Scholarships are important. They're the admissions ticket. Mm-hmm. But what gets students through successfully is the intentional peer mentoring and faculty and staff mentoring, and creating this sense of belonging and mattering and high expectation even before students arrive for their orientation experience. They come for a summer pre-arrival experience at Elon. Relationships are absolutely key to the success of new majority students at universities, and we are doing them a great disservice by admitting them and then not paying attention to the support and care and welcome and love that these students need to experience when they're here.
Yeah. And I was going to ask you, I mean, you started down this, but I was going to ask to kind of push a little bit more on first generation students and also international students who are coming from, you know, educational cultures, right, that are very much the rote memorization, the teacher's the expert, you don't question the teacher. You know, the relational aspect isn't always part of that educational process that they've been inculcated through. You know, one of the guests I had on last year is Jennifer Morton, who's the author of Moving Up Without Losing Your Way. And she really talks about the first generation student. And then there was a well-known book, The Privileged Poor, you know, looking at the difference between students who are poor but came through independent private schools on scholarships, where they were taught to engage the professor, go to office hours, right? That's not a sign of weakness. That's something you do. And so, you know, just tell me a couple more examples of where we can support better the first gen students or international students who haven't been told and given encouragement around how important the relationship building part is.
Well, I think one of the issues is in the academy, we use a lot of code, right? Code speak. I mean, what the heck is a provost? What are drop ads? If you've been sitting around the dinner table and been talking about study abroad experiences with 2 or 3 generations of your family, you've got this gigantic leg up on first generation students and students who are not familiar with American higher education. And so I think just stopping and listening to the vocabulary and the intentionality by which we're communicating about higher ed is really important. I think though the most important thing comes back to how are you, that and knowing your name. it's so critical. We talked with a student at CUNY, as a matter of fact, actually this student's advisor, and we have just been impressed at so many institutions. Students are one conversation away from leaving college. One conversation away from leaving college.
Yeah.
And we need to raise our consciousness about that. And we specifically heard the story of a student who did not know what an annotated bibliography was, which was the first assignment in the English class. And felt embarrassed to ask the professor about that question, didn't feel comfortable going to the writing center. And I'm sure that faculty member and folks in the writing center would have been happy to help. But fortunately, they had an ASAP advisor, somebody that they could go to who was their friend, who said, we can help you with that. That's really simple. We're gonna get through this together. So it's the how are you? It's paying attention to that level of granularity, recognizing that we're in danger of losing a student because they're intimidated by a term that they're not familiar with. Yeah. We can do all of that if we have our eyes open and we have our hearts open.
Well, Leo, I think that's a perfect place to end. I told you 30 minutes was going to feel like, 7 or 8 here, and it has. But the idea for all of us to be motivated by this notion that there are students out there who are just one conversation, one mentoring interaction away from either leaving college or staying the course, right? I think that should be a great motivator for all of us. And I wish you great success with the book. I know you're already working on a second one, which I won't say much about, but I think it's going to be a great contribution. And just wanted to say thank you for your incredible leadership on this. Relationship-Rich Education. If you guys haven't picked it up, definitely make sure you order your copy today. So thank you very much, Leo.
Thanks, Brandon. Peter sends his great regards as well.
Please tell him hello for me. Congratulations.
All right. Good to see you. Bye.